Albert Snyder was an intelligent man who loved the outdoors and sports. He had 6 siblings and was close to his mother. Good with his hands, he would industriously paint walls and paper them for her. The boy grew into a man who was perpetually tanned from many hours of boating and fishing. There were few things Albert liked more than to be out on the sea with the wind blowing through his curly hair. He personified the hail fellow of his time, the early 20th century. His job as art editor of motorboating suited him perfectly. He also liked bowling. However, at 32, he felt something lacking in his life. It was time to find a wife. Albert already had one tragic engagement with a young woman, Jessie Guichard. She had taken ill and died before they could marry. Albert had been at her bedside when pneumonia took Jess's life. He still longed for her even as he got on with his life and work. One day at work, he grew irritated at a telephone operator who had intended to call a manufacturer. The angry art editor let loose a fusillade of harsh words. "Please excuse me," the distressed operator said in a sweet, melodious voice. Albert was suddenly contrite about his temper. He was quick to anger but could put it behind just as fast. He wanted to apologize to the hapless operator in person. He asked where she worked. The face-to-face apology was delivered a few hours later. When he saw the blonde-haired 19-year-old, Albert was instantly captivated. Her name was Ruth Brown. Her co-workers playfully called her Brownie. Perhaps it was her ready smile, her mischievous blue eyes, or her air of anticipating good and exciting things. But Albert knew he wanted to see more of Ruth. He began visiting the telephone switchboard regularly. Just a couple of weeks after meeting the lovely lady, he offered to help her get a job as a reader and copyist at motorboating. It sounded like a step up to Ruth, and she eagerly accepted. The two were soon dating regularly. Ruth was flattered by the older, sophisticated man's attentions. However, his repeated passes distressed her. She was a virgin and planned to remain one until her wedding night. For his part, Albert was frustrated at his inability to get the inexperienced young woman to succumb. Contraception in that era was fallible, and an unmarried woman's pregnancy could ruin her stature. Ruth remained resistant to Albert's overtures. She was, in her own words, a self-respecting girl. Eventually, Albert proposed marriage. "Yes," was Ruth's reply. But Ruth had one request. The name Snyder sounded so Germanic. Could he change the name to something that sounded more American, like Snyder? He agreed, and Albert became a Snyder, as did Ruth. The woman who would later outrage the world was born in the late 1890s to 2 Scandinavian immigrants to the U.S. Her mother had been born Josephine Anderson in Sweden. Her father, Harry Sorensen, came from Norway. Sorensen would change his name to Brown because he wanted a last name that would not give away his origins. As his daughter would years later, he wanted a name that seemed American. He had been a sailor, but to placate his wife and support his family, gave up the sea for life as a carpenter. The change left him perpetually disgruntled and longing for the freedom and adventure of a sailor's life. Harry Brown made a respectable living, but his wages were meager. Frugality was a requirement for a family that consisted of Ruth, an elder brother, and Josephine. Ruth yearned for nice but unattainable things throughout her childhood. No, her parents said, they could not afford that blonde doll. But Ruth was fascinated by the beauty of the doll and went to the store every day just to look through the window at it, until it disappeared because someone else bought it. No, her parents said, she could not have a Shetland pony, nor could they afford a wristwatch, nor a white bedroom set, or that party dress she so admired. They could not take her to the theater. However, money was spent on Ruth for her numerous medical problems. She had epilepsy and often fainted. She had intestinal surgery at age 6. She had an appendectomy a few years later. The surgery was botched, and Ruth Brown was left with various internal ailments in its wake. The Brown family regularly attended the Methodist Episcopal Church. Ruth prayed each night before bed, but later said her faith was not strong. "I didn't believe in my inner heart God existed," she said when recalling her childhood. "But I went through the motions in case I was wrong." School afforded Ruth no solace. She did not have an academic mind and was easily bored by reading, writing, and arithmetic. She never had any strong career aspirations. Her wish was marriage. She believed that she was suited to be a good wife. She was a neat, clean housekeeper, quick with a needle and thread, and a fine cook. A good husband, she believed, would carry her over the threshold into a life of joy, love, and prosperity. Ruth's marriage would not be the dull, banal union of her parents. For one thing, she was a real American, born in a time of optimism. She would find a man who would provide her and their children with the finer things in life. However, she was realistic enough to realize that she would have to get a job while she was single. A training course at the New York Telephone Company accepted her. Ruth was assigned to the night shift where she worked for 2 years until she married Albert. She happily quit New York Telephone. The marriage was troubled from the start. Their age difference may have been part of the problem. Albert just did not have the energy to attend the social events that Ruth so enjoyed. She kept house and served him tasty meals, but Albert wanted more. He wanted someone with whom he could discuss issues and share ideas. Ruth found books and art dull. Why, he wondered, couldn't she be more similar to his beloved Jessie? Why couldn't Ruth take an interest in culture? She always wanted to play bridge or jitterbug and listen to Cole Porter tunes. Ruth also did not share 2 of Albert's other passions, sailing and hiking. For her part, Ruth felt as if she had kissed Prince Charming only to have him become a frog. She could not comprehend his cerebral conversations, nor did she want to. Another problem was that Ruth was becoming increasingly jealous, but her rival was a memory, the dead Jessie Guichard. Albert wore a necktie pin with the initial JG, his sailboat was the Jessie G. Worst of all, perhaps, was that their home had a large picture of Albert's dead fiancée in the living room. There were also many smaller reminders of Jessie, including a photo album devoted to her. Jealousy occasionally got the better of Ruth, and she removed the portrait. But that always led to an intense fight with Albert, who demanded that it be rehung. Then Ruth received what to her was good news. She was pregnant. Albert was not pleased. He had not wanted children. Ruth couldn't understand his attitude. Wasn't one of the main reasons people marry so they can have a family? He was even more disappointed when the child was born and it was a girl. Ruth named her daughter Lorraine. The baby drove the couple further apart. Albert did not share Ruth's interest in the infant, and he did not like being bothered by early morning crying and the smell of diapers. Albert also thought childbirth had ruined Ruth's figure. The family moved from neighborhood to neighborhood in New York City. Then in 1923, they settled into Queens Village. At each residence, Jessie Guichard's portrait had a prominent display. The Queen's home was 2.5 stories, painted muted pink with green trim. 2 maple trees stood in the yard. To the right of the house was a driveway leading to a garage in the back. Eventually, a makeshift bird fountain, constructed out of a large saucepan and a pole, sat in the backyard. Ruth Snyder would spend much time replenishing the pan and calling to birds. At a certain point, Ruth's mother, Josephine Brown, moved into the Snyder home. Ruth now had a babysitter for her daughter. The extroverted Ruth began attending more parties and socials. Delighted by her high spirits, friends nicknamed her Gay Tommy. The word gay did not have its contemporary meaning in that era. One afternoon, when Ruth was lunching with a friend at Henry's, a Swedish restaurant, enjoying a smorgasbord, the friend introduced her to Judd Gray, a slender, bespectacled corset salesman with a chin cleft. Now 32, Ruth was concerned about her figure. She had a tendency to put on weight and may still have been self-conscious about the thickening effect of childbirth on her waistline. Smiling, she asked to see some of Judd's wares. Judd Gray was born in Cortland, New York, in 1882. His family moved to New Jersey when Judd was a toddler. Both parents loved him, but Judd developed a tight bond with his mother. He developed a fondness for reading and for sports, especially tennis and football. He regularly went to church with his family. He went to high school for 2 years, then dropped out because he had a bad bout with pneumonia. He did not want an education. He wanted a job. At first, he worked with his father in the jewelry business. Dissatisfied, he found a job with the Bien Jolie Corset Company. At the age of 22, Judd married Isabel. She had been his girlfriend since he was 16. The couple had 1 child, a daughter. Most people thought of Judd Gray as a nice, ordinary man and a good citizen. He liked to play golf and bridge and drive his automobile. Judd was a good and reliable worker for the Red Cross in World War I. The Grays regularly attended a First Methodist church where Judd worked for the Sunday school. He belonged to the Orange Lodge of Elks. He was also a member of the Corset Salesmen of the Empire Club. Judd's wife Isabel was shy and self-effacing. Several of Judd's work colleagues were surprised to learn that he was married. Judd later wrote of Isabel, and how she could never replace his mother. Isabel, I suppose one would call a homegirl. She had never trained for a career of any kind. She was learning to cook and was a careful and exceptionally exact housekeeper. As I think it over searchingly, I am not sure, and we were married these many years, of her ambitions, hopes, her fears, or her ideals. We made our home, drove our car, played bridge with our friends, danced, raised our child, ostensibly together, married. Never could I seem to attain with her the comradeship that formed the bond between my mother and myself. It was not terribly long after Ruth and Judd met that they were having an affair. Realizing that Judd was a classic mama's boy, Ruth asked him to call her Mommy or Mama, something he was delighted to do. For Judd, Ruth provided the emotional connection and the physical passion sorely lacking in his marriage with Isabel. For Ruth, Judd was a sympathetic ear on whom she could unburden herself of her frustrations at living with a man who nagged and belittled her and kept his most tender feelings for a dead woman. The couple usually met at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where they registered as Mr. and Mrs. Gray. They were such frequent guests that they kept a small suitcase in a hotel locker that included bathrobes, brushes, cards, condoms, pajamas, and slippers. When Judd and Ruth had been drinking, the talk sometimes turned to murder. There are two incompatible versions of how murder first became a topic. Ruth claimed that it was Judd's idea. Judd insisted that Ruth related to him her solitary and unsuccessful attempts to do away with her husband. According to the tale spun by the corset salesman, Ruth confided that she had engineered several accidents for Albert. Once, Albert was in the garage jacking up the Buick to change a tire when the jack slipped. The car fell, and Albert barely missed injury or death. Then he was hit by the crank, knocking Albert unconscious. A third garage accident when his wife bought him some whiskey. The booze made Albert strangely and suddenly sleepy. Very soon he realized that the garage door was closed, and he was breathing carbon dioxide. Panicked, he fled from the Buick's underside and escaped. Ruth had 3 different life insurance policies on her husband. One was for $1,000, another for $5,000, and a third for $45,000. The last had a double indemnity clause, meaning that the insurance company would pay $90,000 if Albert's death was accidental. According to Judd, Ruth tricked Albert into signing all 3 documents by telling him the least expensive policy had to be signed in triplicate. The reason she took out the policies, Ruth claimed, was because Judd suggested it and threatened to tell Albert about their affair if she did not comply. Ruth feared that her husband would get custody of their daughter Lorraine, because the courts would look harshly on an adulteress. She also said that Albert was fully aware of the policies and how much they were worth. She did not want to murder Albert, and did not believe Judd would ever do it, even though he talked about it whenever he had been drinking heavily. On the other hand, Judd claimed that Ruth attempted murder 3 more times on her own. Twice she tried to kill him by turning on the gas tap, and once by giving him bichloride of mercury to drink. And on top of all the claims and counterclaims, Judd had one more. He was compelled to shoot Albert because Albert was threatening to shoot Ruth. Both versions, Ruth's and Judd's, agree that on a trip to Kingston, New York, Judd purchased chloroform, a sash weight, and a picture wire. They also agree that in a meeting at Henry's, where the couple had first met, Judd presented Ruth with a package. He did not reveal its contents, but said, "I'm in an awful hurry, Mommy. I have to get the 1:25 train." Judd told her to take the package home. When Ruth opened the package, she saw that it contained an odd mixture of the prosaic and the profane. First, there was the flesh reducer. This item was something Ruth wanted, a rolling pin device to melt excess fat. She also saw that there was a sash weight, some powders, and a note from Judd. The letter said that she should put the powders in Albert's drink to make him groggy, so that Judd could kill him easily with the weight. Horrified, Ruth poured the powders down the sink. She was going to give the weight back to Judd and terminate the affair. Yet Judd showed up a few days later, saying he was there to finish the governor. Both often called Albert the governor. "Judd, you can't do such a thing," Ruth replied. "Well," he countered, "if I can't do it tonight, I am coming back. To get him." Judd soon sent Ruth another lagniappe. This one also contained powders to spike Albert's drink. Ruth was also instructed to leave the side doors unlocked. Ruth later said she disposed of the powders, but did admit to leaving the doors open. She claimed that her intent was to inform Judd upon his arrival that their relationship was finally over. It was just after midnight on Sunday, March 20th, when Judd slipped into Albert and Ruth Snyder's house through an unlocked side door. Albert, Ruth, and Lorraine were still at a neighbor's house where the adults were playing bridge. Albert had been drinking fairly heavily, but he drove home safely at about 2 a.m. Albert went straight to bed. Mother and child went to Lorraine's room. On the way back to the couple's bedroom, Ruth encountered Judd in the guest bedroom. "Be very quiet," Ruth told him. "I'll see you later." Then Ruth got dressed for bed and lay in a nightgown beside her husband. When she thought he had gone to sleep, she got out of bed and went to see her clandestine visitor. Meanwhile, Judd had donned rubber gloves. "Judd," she said plaintively, "what are you going to do? If you don't let me go through with it tonight, I'm going to get the pair of us. It's he or us." Ruth pulled at his arm and he reluctantly accompanied her downstairs. She pleaded with Judd not to kill Albert. Judd appeared convinced and promised to leave without incident. Relieved, Ruth went upstairs to the bathroom. Then she was startled by a terrific thud. Terrified, she rushed to the bedroom to find Judd on top of her husband, kneeling on Albert's back. She tried to pull him off. Then she fainted. When she regained consciousness, a motionless Albert was piled up with blankets. She started to remove them, but Judd pulled her into her mother's room. "I've gone through with it," he told her, "and you have to stand just as much of the blame as I have. We can frame up a burglary, and we'll both get out of it." Ruth, in shock, listened. "My shirt is covered with blood," Judd said. "Let's see if you have any on you." Looking down at her nightgown, Ruth saw a bloody palm print where Judd had struggled with her. They burned that nightgown and Judd's stained shirt. Judd took one of Albert's shirts. Judd told her to wait while he ransacked the house to fake a burglary. But neither of them thought to take some of the most valuable items in the house, Ruth's jewelry. Instead, Ruth took her jewelry and put it under the mattress. For some reason, neither of them thought to have Judd simply take the jewelry when he left. Then he tied her up and put cheesecloth in her mouth. That was not how the murder happened in Judd's telling of it. He agreed that he had purchased the chloroform, sash weight, and picture wire, but said it was all Ruth's idea. If Ruth did indeed suggest the last item, she may have been thinking of the portrait of Jesse Geishard that hung from a picture wire. He was in her mother's bedroom, as Ruth said, when he saw her taking little Lorraine to her bedroom. Ruth came back to him and whispered, "You're going to do it, aren't you?" "I think I can," Judd replied firmly, even though he claimed a wave of terror washed over him. Ruth turned around and her lover followed her to the bedroom. There Judd struck the first blow, hitting a sleeping Albert with the sash weight. Albert instantly woke up and began a furious fight for his life. He grabbed Judd by the necktie, choking him. Then Ruth hit her husband with the sash weight. Even with the two of them on the man, he fought mightily. Ruth put chloroform on Albert, but that did not stop his struggle. She handed a necktie to Judd, saying, "Tie his hands." Judd could not manage it, and Ruth tied his hands with a towel. Then she tried to cover his head with a sheet while Judd wound the necktie about the struggling man's feet, tying them together. "Is he dead?" Ruth asked. "No," Judd told her. "This thing has absolutely got to go through or I am ruined," she wailed. Judd slugged the man who refused to die and screamed, "Help me, Mommy!" Mommy wound the picture wire around the bleeding man's throat and pulled on it, hard. Finally, Albert Snyder ceased moving. The murderers paused and waited and were certain that he was also no longer breathing. Judd looked down and saw that his shirt and hands were gleaming with blood. He felt disoriented and numb. His mind was blank. "Here," a helpful Ruth said, holding a blue shirt of her late husband before her crime partner. "Put this on." Mechanically, Judd took his shirt off and just as mechanically put this replacement on, slowly buttoning it up. A more efficient Ruth took his blood-stained clothes and hers down to the basement where they were incinerated. He followed her down there and fortified himself with a few drinks. Then he threw things about to simulate a robbery. On the way to the Snyder house, Judd had picked up a scrap of Italian newspaper. That would fit into their plans, the killers decided. They would pin this crime on a couple of immigrants, so they left it in the bed as a false clue. Dawn was breaking as Judd bound his partner to a chair. She opened her mouth so he could place the cheesecloth in. Before he turned to leave, he said, "It may be 2 months, it may be a year, and it may be never before you'll see me again." Judd had gone to a great deal of trouble to set up an alibi. As a traveling salesman, he was in and out of hotels and cities all the time. He had slipped his hotel room key to a longtime friend of his, Haddon Gray, no relation, and told Haddon to go into his room and rumple the bed to make it look slept in. He told Haddon he needed cover for a dinner engagement with Ruth Snyder in Albany, and that he probably would not be back that night. While Haddon was in Judd's room, he was supposed to telephone down to the desk, identify himself as Judd Gray, and tell the operator that he did not feel well and did not wish to be disturbed. Haddon was also supposed to mail some letters Judd had given him and place a "Do Not Disturb" sign on his doorknob. Despite these preparations, Judd bungled his getaway. He made himself strangely conspicuous. Waiting at the bus stop, the murderer struck up a conversation with an elderly man. Judd observed a police officer shooting at a row of beer bottles and jokingly remarked, "I would hate like hell to stand in front of him and have him shoot me." Then he topped that blunder by shouting, "I wouldn't want you shooting at me." After departing the bus at the Jamaica station, he hailed a taxi and asked the driver to take him to Manhattan. Gray left a nickel tip, causing the cab driver to look hard at the man in his rearview mirror. The conductor and porter on the New York Central both noticed him because he told them that he wanted to ride the Pullman ticket to Albany and then ride in coach to Syracuse. Back at the Snyder house, Lorraine Snyder was comfortably asleep in her bed when she was awakened by a series of knocks on her bedroom door. The child opened her eyes, blinking into the morning. Then she heard urgent but strangely muffled words in what was unmistakably her mother's voice. "Lorraine," Ruth said. "Lorraine, come quick." The pajama-clad youngster jumped out of her bed and rushed to the source of the noises. She could hardly believe her eyes. Her mother was on the floor, helpless and bound with a cord. Her face was white as chalk and her eyes wide with terror. Her father lay on the bed, his bloody arm protruding from under a sheet. Lorraine threw on a bathrobe and headed to a neighbor's home. Shivering more from fright than the cool morning air, she banged on the door until Mr. and Mrs. Mulhauser answered. Through chattering teeth, the little girl told how somebody had killed her daddy and her mommy was bound up with ropes. The Mulhausers headed to the Snyder home, where they found things much as the child had described. The couple tried to free Ruth from her bindings, but the dazed woman refused to be freed before the police made their appearance. When the police arrived, they found a scene of utter chaos. Cushions had been tossed hither and yon, drawers pulled out and left open, and the curtains torn down. The police realized one thing immediately. This was not what a burglary really looked like. The pretty blonde woman whose husband had been murdered was only semi-coherent. However, they were able to piece together a tale from the fragments that babbled out of her mouth. She and her husband had come home from a party, and they had been assaulted by two men who looked Italian. The men had beat on her husband's head. "My jewelry," she cried. "They took my jewelry." One police officer questioned Ruth while others looked about for clues. They easily found one, a scrap of Italian newspaper in the bed where the murdered man lay. But like the furniture scattered for no reason, it was fishy. They also found the stolen jewelry under the mattress. Officer Arthur Carey began looking through Mrs. Snyder's bankbook. He found a $200 check made out to one Judd Gray. His name was also in her phone book. They found a pin with JG for Jesse Gishard and thought it was Judd Gray's. Mail arrived, and with it a letter from Judd that had been posted in Syracuse. It was a jaunty note that began, "Hello, Mama. How the dickens are you this bright, beautiful day?" They asked the new widow to come down to headquarters for questioning. A police officer asked, "What about Judd Gray?" "Has he confessed?" a startled Ruth asked. The police assured her that they had not yet even found Gray for questioning. Carey consulted with the district attorney, then had both Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray arrested for first-degree murder. In their confessions, each pinned as much blame on the other as possible. Perhaps because of his small stature and rather wimpy appearance, almost everyone seemed to accept Judd's story that Ruth had talked him into murder. As reporter Peggy Hopkins Joyce wrote in the Daily Mirror, "Poor Judd Gray. He hasn't anything. He is just a sap who kissed and was told on." The Herald Tribune wrote about Judd, "All facts now adduced point to a love-made man completely in the sway of the woman whose will was steel." The couple was often labeled the Granite Woman and the Putty Man. Terms describing Ruth alone included fiend wife, faithless wife, blonde fiend, marble woman, flaming Ruth, Woman of Steel, Hard-Faced Woman, Vampire, and Ruthless Ruth, the Viking ice matron of Queen's Village. She was compared to Lucretia Borgia, Messalina, and Lady Macbeth. Playwright Willard Mack wrote in an essay, "If Ruth Snyder is a woman, then by God, you must find some other name for my mother, wife, or sister." When Judd Gray and Ruth Snyder went on trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators wanting to glimpse the blonde-haired, slightly plump granite woman, attired all in black, as well as her slightly built putty man in his three-pieced pinstriped suit. 3 different narratives of the murder of Albert Snyder were presented. One was that of the prosecutor, short but powerfully built Richard Newcomb, who pointed his finger equally at Ruth and Judd as co-conspirators and murderers. The fingers of Ruth Snyder's lawyers, Edgar Hazelton and Dana Wallace, pointed at Judd, who, in their version, had committed the murder entirely on his own and was trying to hide behind Ruth's skirt. Judd Gray's attorneys, William Millard and Samuel Miller, did not deny his part in the slaying, but indicated mitigating circumstances because of Ruth's powers of persuasion. Interestingly, both sets of defense attorneys tried to save their clients by draping them in cultural paradigms of gender victimization. Hazelton told the jury that his client was no gay butterfly or woman of many loves, but a real, loving wife. A good wife, whose husband drove love from that home by pining for his dead love, Jesse Guichard. Poor Ruth was then seduced and manipulated by silver-tongued Judd Gray. Trying to impress these points upon the jury, Hazelton intoned that woman is just as God intended her, were it not for some man. And we will prove to you that Mrs. Ruth Snyder is just as God intended her to be, were it not for her incompatible husband and the deceiver Gray. Gray lawyer Willard Millard saw it very differently. Before meeting Ruth Snyder, Judd Gray had not a blemish, not a move outside the normal paths of life. He was a wonderful boy. Wonderful, not a mark, not a scratch, not a stain, not a blot. A splendid, ideal character. Then Millard said, "That woman, that peculiar creature, like a poisonous snake, like a poisonous serpent, drew Judd Gray into her glistening coils, and there was no escape. Just as a piece of steel jumps and clings to the powerful magnet, so Judd Gray came within the powerful compelling force of that woman, and she held him fast. This woman, this peculiar venomous species of humanity, was abnormal, possessed of an all-consuming, all-absorbing sexual passion, animal lust, which seemingly never was satisfied. Sexy Ruth was Eve, and the serpent rolled into one, an irresistible temptress. Nearly everyone in the courtroom and elsewhere seemed to buy Judd's version of his succumbing to Ruth's domination. But it did him no practical good. There was no way to get around the fact that he had willingly participated in a premeditated murder. The jury found both defendants guilty of first-degree murder. On May 13, 1927, the judge sentenced both to be executed. Shortly after the sentence was passed, Ruth Snyder converted to Roman Catholicism. Some more cynical observers believed that this was a calculated ploy to win a commutation from New York Governor Alfred Smith, also a Roman Catholic. If so, it was a mistake. The governor was even less likely to extend mercy to a co-religionist and leave himself vulnerable to charges of religious favoritism. Ruth and Judd were taken to the death house at Sing Sing, where Ruth would be the only woman during her stay. While much of the general public sympathized with Judd as a man caught in the coils of an evil woman and hated Ruth, sentiment in Sing Sing was precisely reversed. There is nothing more despised in the hyper-masculine world of male criminals than male weakness. Shifting blame for one's own crime onto a woman made the putty man lower than a slug in the eyes of most of his fellow prisoners, and they shunned him. He was, however, able to make a few friends. Gray found it possible to converse with the occupants in the cells bordering his. He even managed to play checkers with them by calling out moves corresponding to the numbered squares on a checkerboard. While denounced in the press in terms of horror, Ruth did have her admirers. They were submissive men who swallowed hook, line, and sinker Judd's depiction of her powers. Ruth received 164 offers of marriage from men who, in the event of her being reprieved, were eager to exist humbly beneath her dominance. Even more isolated than her co-defendant, Ruth spent her time writing. Her memoirs would be published as My Own True Story, So Help Me God, in the New York Daily Mirror. It was a confused mishmash of observations, memories, and outright craziness. The first step on her way to her present predicament had begun with adultery, Ruth believed, so she devoted much of her prose to warning other women away from affairs. "I wish a lot of women who may be sinning," she penned, "could come here and see what I have done for myself through sinning, and maybe they would do some of the thinking I have done for months, and they would be satisfied with their homes, and would stop wishing for things they should try to get along without when they can't have them. Maybe there are women who have nice homes, and husbands who do the best they can for them, even if they don't like their husbands, and they could bear it if they would only make up their minds. Everything can't be just perfect. Some husbands don't make enough money to get their wives the things they wish they had, and if the wives have the brains, they will just take what they can get and try to make the best of it." As the months of sustained terror wore on, Ruth's mind began to unravel. It showed in her writing. She wrote, "Judd Gray talks about the big brown bug he put out of its misery. Does he, JG, ever think back of Ruth Brown's bug he put out of his misery?" What Ruth refers to here is quite unclear, but the question automatically occurs to the reader. Was Albert Snyder Ruth Brown's bug? On January 12, 1928, both people convicted of murdering Albert Snyder were put to death. In keeping with the Sing Sing tradition of executing the most distressed prisoner first and getting the worst of an inevitably grisly business out of the way, Ruth was taken to the electric chair before Judd. Her entire head was not shaved, but a bald spot was made for the electrode. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying as she was led to the death chamber, a matron holding her under each of her arms. When she saw the electric chair, she started screaming hysterically and her body went limp. The matrons forced her to the chair as she shrieked, "Jesus, have mercy on me." Then, as the black leather mask was placed over her face, she prayed aloud for her executioners using Christ's words, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Just as her body shook with the force of electricity, a newspaper photographer raised his trouser cuff where he hid a small camera and snapped a picture of her dying. Cameras were forbidden at executions, but this man had smuggled it in, and the photograph appeared on front pages the next morning. It is still frequently displayed in articles about the death penalty. When Judd was brought in, he was obviously terrified, but not faint. He walked to the chair, even as rivulets of sweat poured down the skin of his ghost-white face. He and the clergyman who accompanied him said parts of the Beatitudes to each other. "Blessed are the pure in spirit," Judd announced as he sat in the death chair. "Blessed are they that mourn," the clergyman replied. "For they will be comforted," Judd filled in. "Blessed are the merciful." The guards had trouble adjusting the leather mask to his face. An obliging Judd held his head still so they could do their job. Then electricity shocked the life out of Judd Gray. Why does the sad story of Judd Gray and Ruth and Albert Snyder evoke such interest? People in general may identify with, more than they would like to believe, the victim and the killers. Some men may recognize themselves in the offhand, belittling cruelty of Albert Snyder. Other men may recall regret for mistreating a woman they loved. Some women know what it's like to be married to uncommunicative men and identify with Ruth Snyder on that level. Some of them react to her with fierce condemnation, but that too may be the result of uneasily seeing some small part of their own lives in hers. Perhaps the case holds interest because of the way in which so many perennial human faults, including insensitivity, greed, lust, heartlessness, and finally plain stupidity, came together to create tragedy.